Remember those simple, scrappy toys? The ones you only had because they were all your family could afford? For poor kids in the 1970s, these toys came from yard sales, dollar bins, or older siblings, but they still sparked endless afternoons of play. And looking back now, why do those cheap little things mean more than anything that came in a shiny box? Cardboard box forts were not toys you bought. They were toys you waited for. Whenever your parents brought home a new appliance or someone in the neighborhood left a big box by the curb, you pounced. Refrigerator boxes were gold. Washer and dryer boxes were nearly as good. You dragged them into the yard or living room, crawled inside, and suddenly, fort, house, spaceship, whatever you needed that day. You cut out windows with dull scissors, drew buttons and doors with broken crayons, taped pieces together using masking tape that barely held but made you feel like an engineer. The floor was the same grass or shag carpet as always, but inside the box, you had your own place, your rules, no adults allowed. It smelled like cardboard and dust, and by the second day it was collapsing, but you did not care. You had sleepovers in there, ate peanut butter sandwiches in there, sometimes even cried in there when things felt too big. And if the rain came or someone accidentally crushed it, well, you just waited for the next one. Because when you were poor, imagination was the real toy, and cardboard was always in stock. A box could be anything you needed it to be for as long as it lasted. It cost nothing. It did everything. And when someone asked you what you were playing, you smiled from your cardboard window and said, you wouldn't get it. Plastic army men were sold by the bag, and if you were lucky, the bag was big. You got dozens of tiny soldiers for under $1. They came in green, sometimes tan or gray, and each one had a different pose, crawling, aiming, charging with a bayonet. They were stiff, light, and rough around the edges, literally. Half of them still had the plastic mold seams sticking out like little battle scars. You spread them out on the floor or lined them up in the dirt, ready for war. You did not care about historical accuracy. These guys had one job: make noise and take hits. You would flick marbles at them or throw pebbles until only one was left standing. Sometimes you built bunkers out of books. Sometimes you buried the losers in the sandbox like fallen heroes. One would always lose a leg. Another would get melted by accident. You kept them anyway. You gave them names, rivalries, missions. Even though they could not move, they had stories. And they went with you everywhere, stuffed in pockets, backpacks, even hidden under pillows. It did not matter that they were cheap. They were yours. And when the battles were over, you lined them back up, ready to go again tomorrow. They were quiet, unbreakable, and loyal, just like the kids who played with them. Homemade sock puppets were not toys from a store. They were toys from a drawer. You grabbed an old sock, one that had lost its match or had a hole near the toe, and brought it to life. You could glue on buttons for eyes, draw a mouth with marker, cut up yarn for hair if you had some lying around. If not, you just used your fingers and imagination. You slipped it on your hand and gave it a voice. A silly one, a deep one, whatever made your siblings laugh or annoyed your parents just enough. It lived in shoebox theaters and behind couch cushions. It had adventures in cereal boxes and battles in laundry baskets. You made up whole worlds with nothing but scraps. That puppet had feelings. It had drama. It had a full-on personality. You did not need a TV show. You made your own. Right there in the living room, using a sock and a stack of couch cushions. Even if the eyes fell off or the mouth smeared, you kept performing. Because when you were poor, entertainment was not downloaded. It was stitched together, one laugh at a time. And years later, you might not remember the sock's name, but you remember how it made you feel. Funny, creative, enough. Off-brand dolls with stiff legs were the kind of gift you got from the dollar store, the flea market, or someone's older cousin. They came in thin cardboard boxes with a plastic window and usually had wild hair and eyes that never quite looked straight ahead. The clothes were shiny, but paper thin. The shoes never fit, and the arms moved like they had arthritis. But you loved them anyway. They were your baby, your best friend, your co-star in soap opera-style drama that took place entirely on your bedroom floor. The legs did not bend, so you made up reasons she always stood or laid down. If her arm broke off, you made a sling. If the head popped off, you popped it back on like a pro. You gave her a name, a story, maybe even a tiny house made out of a shoebox. You brushed her hair with a toothbrush and made new outfits out of old socks and scraps. She might not have been a Barbie, but she was yours, and that was more important. You brought her everywhere, to the grocery store, to your cousin's house, to bed. And even if her eyes were a little scary and her legs never quite worked, she helped you dream. And that was worth more than any name brand. Stick in a dirt pile sounds like a joke, but it was real. You found a patch of dry earth, grabbed a decent stick, and suddenly you were building roads, castles, or digging to the other side of the world. The dirt was your canvas. The stick was your tool. No batteries, no rules, no cleanup instructions. You made ditches for your toy cars, dug trenches for army men, buried treasure, drew racetracks, built ant cities. It left your fingernails black and your knees brown, but you did not care. That little patch of dirt became your kingdom, and that stick was all you needed to rule it. It was your sword, your shovel, your blueprint, and your best tool. You used it to write in the mud, carve messages, or make maps that only you could read. You could draw whole cities, then destroy them with one swoop. You fought imaginary battles, raced imaginary cars, and gave yourself a promotion to foreman just because you could. And when you snapped it in two, you grabbed another stick and kept building like nothing happened. You got blisters, splinters, maybe even a few scoldings, but you kept going. Because nothing beat the feeling of carving out something from nothing. Poor kids turned backyards and alleyways into construction zones, battlefields, and stadiums, no budget required. You could play for hours, sun up to sun down. And when you were finally called inside, you left your stick leaning against the wall, ready for tomorrow's work. Jump ropes made from clothesline were the definition of make-do. You could not always afford the brightly colored ropes with the plastic handles from the store, but if you had a long enough piece of clothesline and two willing hands, you had a toy. You tied knots at the ends, maybe added tape to make a grip. Sometimes it was just string, rough, thin, and quick to burn your palm if it slipped. But you jumped anyway. On the sidewalk, in the driveway, alone or with friends turning both ends. It slapped the pavement in rhythm like a drum beat, marking time between laughs. You made up new rhymes, some silly, some secret. You dared each other to go faster, higher, longer without tripping. And even when your feet tangled and you fell, you got back up and asked for another turn. That rope was your challenge and your champion. Proof that you did not need anything fancy to feel free. You said the rhymes, missed the beat, laughed so hard your ribs hurt. The rope would leave little red marks on your ankles and arms, and you wore them like medals. If it frayed or snapped, you tied it back together and kept jumping. It was not about the rope. It was about what you did with it. Because poor kids learned early that fun was not about the price tag. It was about the rhythm. Jumping rope was freedom. It was movement. It was breath and grit and laughter, all wrapped up in one swinging line. Used board games from garage sales were like treasure chests missing half the jewels, but you still played. You found them in cardboard boxes next to chipped mugs and old lamps. Sometimes they were just $1, sometimes free if the seller liked you. You brought them home and opened the box like it held gold. The pieces were often scattered. The rules were missing. The dice were from a different game entirely. But you and your siblings made it work. You turned bottle caps into player tokens, dug marbles out of drawers to roll as dice, and rewrote every rule until it felt like yours. You argued over who got to be banker and who had to play as the bent card. You used broken crayons to keep score and taped up torn boards with band-aids if that was all you had. Sometimes you made up a whole new game from scraps, calling it a custom edition, and you swore it was better than the one in stores. You rewrote the rules, made up your own, and argued until someone gave in. You replaced lost pawns with buttons, coins, or jelly beans. When the spinner broke, you made one out of paper. When the board tore, you taped it up with whatever you had. It was not perfect, but it was yours, and you played like the game still had magic in it. Because when the world gave you scraps, you still found a way to play. You did not need the latest version. You needed a rainy day, a few friends, and a table. That was enough. Penny candy and toy capsule prizes were the original budget jackpot. You walked into the corner store or gas station with a handful of change and walked out like you had hit the lottery. A paper sack filled with wax lips, candy cigarettes, sour balls, and licorice ropes. Maybe a gumball that cracked your molars. Maybe a rubber monster from the capsule machine by the door. You turned the dial, heard that heavy clunk, and opened the clear dome to reveal a tiny treasure. Sometimes it was a sticky hand. Sometimes it was a cheap plastic ring. Sometimes it was a disappointment, but it was yours. You pressed your face to the glass dome trying to pick your favorite before the crank decided your fate. You shook the capsule like it might turn into something better if you just gave it a second. You kept the best prizes in a box or hid them from your siblings like they were state secrets. And if the toy broke in 5 minutes, you still bragged about it like it was a trophy. Because even tiny treasures felt big when they were yours to pick. You kept the capsules and reused them, storing your own trinkets inside like they were crown jewels. The candy was not gourmet, but it was sugar. And sugar was gold when you were a kid with no allowance. You planned every penny, measured every treat, and learned the real meaning of value. Because back then, joy came cheap, but it still meant the world. 1 nickel, 1 bite, 1 little thrill at a time. And somehow those tiny prizes left the biggest memories. Matchbox cars, especially the off-brand kind, were tiny engines of freedom. They were handed down, traded at school, found in junk drawers and old shoeboxes. Some rolled smooth, some had bent axles and missing wheels, but every one of them got raced across kitchen floors, dirt driveways, and the arms of worn-out couches. You made engine sounds with your mouth, built ramps from cardboard, pretended one was a race car, the next was a getaway vehicle. The cheap ones chipped paint fast and sometimes lost their tires on day one, but you kept them. You lined them up by color or speed, gave them names, and swore this one right here was the fastest in the world. They raced across dinner tables, battled in gravel, and launched from windowsills with the sound of childhood. Even if they were scratched and dented, they were worth everything to you. Because it was not about the brand, it was about the play. Those little cars went places, even when you could not. Rag dolls sewn at home were love stitched into fabric. Your mom, your grandma, your neighbor, they made them with leftover cloth, buttons, yarn, and care. Sometimes the eyes were mismatched. Sometimes the arms were crooked. Sometimes the seams showed. But it was yours, and it was perfect. You slept with it, talked to it, brought it everywhere. It sat at the dinner table, on your bed, in the back seat of the car. It might have been stuffed with old socks or worn-out t-shirts, but you did not mind. Its dress was hand-stitched, its smile was crooked, and you swore it had a soul. You hugged it when things were hard and carried it like a secret you never had to explain. Store-bought dolls had boxes. Yours had stories. And long after you outgrew it, you kept it tucked in a drawer, just in case you needed to remember what love felt like. It did not need to be perfect. It just needed to be yours. Hand-me-down stuffed animals were more than toys. They were survivors. They had missing eyes, frayed seams, and patches that told their own stories. You never got them brand new. They came from cousins, older siblings, or a neighbor down the street. Some were passed down so many times, no one remembered who bought them in the first place. They smelled like closets and worn fabric. Their fur was matted, their stuffing uneven. But they were soft in all the right places and firm enough to hold when you needed something solid. You gave them names even if the tag was gone. You tucked them under blankets, took them on road trips, and cried into them without embarrassment. They sat on your bed when the world felt too big, and they listened without ever saying a word. Even when they started to fall apart, you begged not to throw them away. Because they had been through everything with you, and when you had nothing new, something old still meant love. And sometimes the most beat-up stuffed animal was the one with the biggest heart. They were worn, they were ugly, they were perfect, And if you were poor in the 70s, chances are your favorite toy came with a history already stitched in. Milk jug caps and bottle tops were not meant to be toys, but we made them one. When you had no money for real action figures or accessories, you dug through the recycling bin and found magic in the mundane. The plastic caps from milk jugs became wheels, shields, tokens, or coins. Metal bottle caps were more dangerous, but made great currency in imaginary games. You lined them up, flipped them, traded them, and pretended they meant something big. Your living room carpet became a battlefield. The caps were soldiers. The couch legs were castle towers. A handful of tops meant you were rich, at least in the economy of imagination. Some kids melted the edges with sunlight and a magnifying glass, reshaping them into weird inventions. Others colored them with markers and gave them names like Power Cap or Laser Shield. You could play marbles-style games with them, flicking them across the sidewalk or kitchen floor for points. And if you lost one, no big deal. You would just finish your drink and start again. It was endless, cheap, and somehow way more fun than anything wrapped in plastic at the store. Poor kids turned garbage into gold long before it was trendy. They were not pretty, but they were yours. And all they cost was a little creativity. Jacks and a ball were all you needed to pass the time, on the porch, at school, or on the living room rug when it rained. The whole set came in a plastic pouch you could get at the dime store, or maybe you just found a ball and borrowed someone else's jacks. The game was simple. Bounce the ball, scoop the jacks before it landed again, but it was never really simple. You got better every week. You went from onesies to tensies, like it was a rite of passage. The jacks made a satisfying clatter across the floor, like you were summoning something old and important. Sometimes the ball bounced too far and rolled under the couch. Sometimes you missed and called for a redo no one really gave. But you played until your knees hurt and your hands were red from slapping the ground. And when you dropped one jack and stepped on it barefoot later, well, you learned that toy pain is still pain. But you also learned precision, focus, and how to win with nothing but reflexes and floor space. It was a quiet game, but intense, especially when your pride was on the line. And for a few minutes, the world shrunk to a rubber ball, 10 tiny jacks, and whether or not you could beat your last round. Homemade paper dolls were fragile, flat little friends you built yourself. All it took was a sheet of notebook paper, some crayons, and a pair of scissors your mom did not want you using. You sketched a figure, maybe two. Then you drew outfits, lots of them, with little paper tabs that folded over their shoulders and hips. They never quite fit right, but they worked if you were careful. Sometimes you copied real people. Sometimes you invented princesses, astronauts, or disco stars. They had lives, names, and wardrobes made entirely of thin, wrinkled pages. You carried them in envelopes, stacked their clothes in old lunch bags, and treated every new outfit like it was high fashion. If one tore, you taped it and said it was an injury. If it got wet, you made a new one and called it a twin. And when you played with someone else's dolls, you always promised to give them back, but secretly wished you could keep one. You made weddings, parties, and imaginary dramas play out on the floor with paper and tape. And somehow, those crayon lines and folded flaps held more excitement than anything on a screen ever could. They were delicate, they were handmade, and they proved that with a little creativity, a child could create a whole world out of scraps. Toy dinosaurs in bulk packs were the cheapest way to feel like a scientist. You got a dozen or more in a mesh bag or cardboard box at the drugstore or discount aisle. They were small, plastic, and mostly green or gray. Some were as hard as rocks, others soft and rubbery. You knew the names from books or just made them up on the spot. Stegosaurus, Brontosaurus, Chomposaurus. You set them up on tabletops and dirt patches or inside your cereal bowl when no one was looking. Some were clearly meant to be T-Rexes but had the arms of a gorilla and the legs of a bird. You played with them anyway. You buried them in the yard and dug them up like an archaeologist, brushing away the dirt with a toothbrush. You made roaring sounds and narrated your own version of prehistory with dramatic flair. When you lost one, it was a crisis. When you found it a week later in your backpack, it was a miracle. They might have been mass-produced and low on detail, but in your hands, they were alive. Toy dinosaurs made you feel smart, adventurous, and totally in control of a tiny world. And for a kid growing up with very little, that kind of power meant everything. Yo-yos from the dime store were a test of patience wrapped in plastic. You picked one out by color, bright red, neon green, or maybe clear with glitter inside, and hoped it actually worked. Sometimes it did, sometimes it tangled the second you tried a trick. But that was half the fun. You practiced over and over. Walk the dog, rock the cradle, loop the loop. Most of the time you just made it go down and back up. The string got dirty fast and the yo-yo cracked if it hit the sidewalk wrong, but you kept trying. You compared tricks at recess, even if the other kid's yo-yo cost 3 times as much. And if you could get it to sleep, just for 2 seconds, you felt like a magician. You kept it in your pocket, scuffed and worn, like a badge of determination. And no matter how many knots you had to untangle, you came back for more. It was not just about skill, it was about persistence. And every time that little toy made its way back to your hand, it felt like a tiny win. Paddleball with the elastic string was chaos in a toy. You got it in party bags, at the drugstore, or from your dentist's treasure box if you were lucky. It was a flat wooden paddle with a red rubber ball attached by a cheap string, and if you could hit it more than 5 times in a row, you were officially gifted. The string always got twisted, the ball snapped back at your face, the paddle chipped, and still, you kept trying. You stood in the driveway or the hallway or anywhere with 5 feet of clearance and swatted that thing until your wrist hurt. Some kids were naturals. The rest of us made noise and hoped to break our last record. When the string finally gave out, you saved the paddle for another game, or threw it like a boomerang. It was frustration disguised as fun, but it kept you busy. And when you hit that rhythm just right, it felt like you had cracked the code. It was silly, loud, and endlessly addictive. And it proved that even the most basic toy could give you something to aim for. Plastic cowboys and horses came in bags the size of your forearm, sold at dime stores for next to nothing. You dumped them out and sorted them by pose, gun drawn, rifle ready, lasso mid-throw. The horses never stood straight. The cowboys never quite fit in the saddles, but you forced them anyway. You built towns out of cardboard and corral fences out of popsicle sticks. The cowboys had names, rivalries, showdowns. You made horse gallop sounds with your mouth, rolled the cowboys down hills, and set up ambushes in the sandbox. Sometimes the paint wore off in a day. Sometimes the horse's legs bent until it looked more like a giraffe. But you kept them, played hard, then shoved them into a shoebox until the next round. They had hats molded to their heads and faces without features, but you saw everything in them. They were freedom, adventure, and a whole world west of your backyard. It did not take much. A patch of grass and a little time, and you were riding into the sunset. Tin kazoos were the loudest way to be poor and proud of it. You could find them in party bags or gas station bins near the counter. Just a cheap piece of metal with a wax paper disc inside, but oh, the power it gave you. You blew into it like a trumpet and made music that sounded like a robot choking, but louder. You annoyed siblings, alarmed pets, entertained yourself for hours. The edges sometimes cut your lip, but you kept blowing until the wax paper wore out. When it did, you tried to fix it with plastic wrap or foil, anything that would vibrate. You had no idea how it worked, just that it did. And that was enough. You marched around the house with it, part of a one-kid parade no one signed up for. And when someone threatened to throw it away, you hid it like treasure. It was simple, it was loud, and it made you feel like the center of attention, even if you were driving everyone else crazy. Whistles or slide flutes from party bags were tiny instruments of joy, and sometimes chaos. You got them for free at birthdays, dentist offices, or school prize boxes. They were usually plastic, neon, and barely held together. But they worked. You blew into one end, slid the stick up and down, and made music that sounded like a balloon crying. It was ridiculous. It was hilarious. And it was yours. You learned how to play Happy Birthday badly and practiced until everyone begged you to stop. You brought it to school in your pocket and played it in secret until it was taken away. If it cracked, you taped it. If the stick broke, you still blew into the bass and made whatever sound it had left. It was not a toy you picked. It was a toy you got. And it was better than nothing. Because even one silly noise was proof you had something fun in your hand. It was plastic, loud, and maybe a little annoying. But it made you smile. And that was more than enough. Marbles in a coffee can were the closest thing a poor kid had to a treasure chest. You might have gotten them in a hand-me-down tin, a dusty shoebox, or just dug them up from the dirt. But the coffee can, the old metal kind with a plastic lid, was the gold standard. Inside, it was a jumble of cat's eyes, swirls, solids, chipped ones, and mystery pieces that looked like they came from Mars. Each marble had a name. Each had a backstory. You traded them on the playground like currency. Sometimes you played for keeps, sometimes just for fun. The sound of that can rattling with glass was unmistakable. It meant a game was about to start. You would draw a chalk ring in the driveway or scratch a circle into the dirt, kneel down, and flick your shooter like it was your last shot on Earth. You played ringer, knuckle down, or just made up new rules on the spot. And even when you lost your best marble, you still had the thrill of the game and the pride of playing fair. No batteries, no plastic, just skill, luck, and the kind of focus that made time slow down. Parents did not always understand the appeal, but for kids who did not have much, those marbles felt like magic. And that coffee can? It held more than glass. It held bragging rights, dreams, and a little bit of playground glory. Wooden tops were what you got before fancy spinning toys existed, or before you could afford them. These were the toys your grandfather might have carved, or your older cousin handed down with a string and some rules you never fully understood. They were small, solid, and felt important in your palm. The good ones had that perfect balance, where a single flick of the wrist could send it spinning for what felt like hours. Most times, you just tried to make it stand upright. You wrapped the string tight, held your breath, and pulled hard like it mattered more than anything. Then you'd watch it whirl, wobble, and finally give in to gravity. And for those few seconds, you felt like you had control over something in the world. It did not always spin right. Sometimes it hit a crack in the floor or a pebble in the dirt and toppled instantly. But that just made the good spins feel even better. Tops could be plain wood or painted with simple stripes. If you were lucky, someone had burned a design into the bottom. They did not make noise. They did not light up. But they did something even better. They gave you a challenge. And when you finally got it to spin perfectly, even just once, you felt like a champion. Rubber balls from the grocery store gumball machine were a childhood gamble wrapped in plastic and possibility. You spotted them while standing in line, eyeing the vending machine next to the gum and cheap toys. If you were lucky enough to have a spare coin, usually from digging under couch cushions, you'd drop it in, turn the knob, and hope for a good one. The ball plunked down with a satisfying thunk. Sometimes it was clear with glitter inside. Sometimes it was neon or had weird swirls like lava. And sometimes, let's be honest, it was a dud. Too soft, not bouncy or flat on one side. But when it was a good one, you knew it. You'd slam it to the sidewalk and watch it bounce higher than your head. You chased it down driveways, into bushes, or out into the street while someone yelled at you to watch for cars. You played wall ball, foursquare, or just bounced it off the side of the house for hours. It was fast, unpredictable, perfect. Even when it bounced straight into the gutter, you swore you could get it back. And sometimes you did. The best ones lasted a summer. The rest rolled under the fridge or got eaten by the lawnmower. But for one coin, one twist, and 1 second of suspense, you had your whole afternoon figured out. Plastic Slinkys that never made it down the stairs were every kid's heartbreak, and hope rolled into a coil. They looked amazing in the store, rainbow-colored, stretchy, hypnotic. You saw the commercials. You knew what they were supposed to do, bounce from stair to stair like magic. But if you bought the cheap version, or more likely got it from a dollar store, you learned real quick that it did not work like that. The first time you dropped it from the top of the stairs, it took one lopsided hop and collapsed like a tired worm. You picked it up, tried again. You adjusted each coil like it was brain surgery. You even tried flipping it over or walking it with your hands, hoping to unlock the secret motion. But it always twisted, bent, or tangled. And when a slinky tangled, it was game over. Still, you kept it. You stretched it across the room, hung it from your doorknob, wore it like a bracelet. It squeaked, snapped, and sometimes pinched. But it was yours. A plastic slinky might not have delivered on its promise, but it gave you something else. Patience, creativity, and the stubborn belief that maybe next time it would work. Stickers from the teacher's drawer were better than gold because they came with pride. These were not fancy or collectible. They came in bulk sheets with cartoon apples, crooked stars, or smiling suns. Some said, "Great job," or "Super Speller" in rainbow bubble letters. Others were just foil stars that peeled off like treasure. But they meant something. You got one for finishing your math early, for being kind, for cleaning up someone else's mess without being asked. When the teacher reached into that drawer and called your name, your heart thumped like you won an award. You stuck it on your notebook, your desk, your shirt, anywhere it could be seen. And if it was scratch and sniff, that was the holy grail. The smells were weird: fake strawberry, burnt pizza, mystery grape. But you sniffed them anyway. You collected stickers on folders, inside textbooks, even on your hand until the glue gave out. You compared with classmates, traded when you could, and protected the rare ones like sacred scrolls. They did not cost a thing. But they reminded you that effort got noticed, that someone saw you trying. And for a poor kid in a big class, sometimes that little rectangle of paper said what no one else did. You did good. There was something magical about a Saturday morning where math and grammar danced across your screen to a killer beat. Schoolhouse Rock was the rare mix of educational and unforgettable. Launched in the early 1970s, these animated shorts played during cartoon blocks, slipping in lessons between episodes of superheroes and slapstick. But they did not feel like school. They felt like music videos made just for kids, catchy, colorful, and endlessly clever. Conjunction Junction, I'm Just a Bill, 3 is a magic number. These were not just songs. They were memory hooks, hooks that stayed with you for life. Even now, adults who grew up in that era can still sing every word. That is how deep it went. That is how much it mattered. Schoolhouse Rock did not just teach facts, it taught confidence. You could walk into class knowing what an adverb was, not because of your teacher, but because a cartoon train told you so. And you believed it. It gave kids ownership of knowledge. It made learning feel cool. In a time before digital everything, it was one of the first shows to prove that entertainment could be smart without being boring. It was a soundtrack to childhood that made your brain sing. The used bookstore with the ham radios in the back was the kind of place where time folded in on itself. You walked in and the smell hit you first: paper, dust, and something that might have been pipe smoke from 50 years ago. Dad would head for the nonfiction section like it was a treasure map, and you would start flipping through comics that had long-forgotten characters in them. Every wall was covered in books, stacked too deep, sometimes sideways, sometimes just crammed in with no regard for order. But the real secret was in the back room. That was where the ham radios lived. Static buzzed from old speakers, and every now and then a voice would crackle through saying something like, "Calling from Connecticut. Do you copy?" Dad would nod slowly, say, "Nice rig," and start talking shop with the owner like they were part of some invisible club. You never understood a word of it, but it felt cool anyway, like your dad knew something no one else did. He would pick up a radio, fiddle with a dial, and say, "This one's got personality." The man behind the counter always nodded like that meant something. But if you thought that place had character, wait until you see Dad at the county auction barn, outbidding strangers for a box of who knows what. Rubiks Cubes sat on coffee tables like miniature monuments to frustration. Their colorful sides promised fun, but more often delivered rage. You twisted, you turned, you thought you had it, and then disaster. One wrong move sent you back to square one. Solving it became a badge of honor. If someone at school could actually complete a Rubiks Cube, they were treated like a genius. Crowds gathered, applause broke out, but most of us faked it. We peeled off the stickers and rearranged them to make it look solved, or we popped out the pieces and snapped them back into place. Technically cheating? Maybe. Spiritually rewarding? Absolutely. There were books, guides, even videos explaining how to beat the cube, but few had the patience. And yet, we all kept trying. Rubik's Cubes lived in junk drawers, backpacks, and classroom desks. They were part toy, part puzzle, part stress test. Looking back, they were frustrating, addictive, and completely iconic. And to this day, if you spot one on a shelf, your hands remember the rhythm of twist, turn, twist, even if your brain still has no idea how to actually solve it. Shrinky dinks were magic in plastic form. You started with a sheet, clear, flexible, and begging to be colored. You grabbed your markers, drew a wild design, cut it out with safety scissors, and popped it in the oven. What came out was a tiny, hardened version of your masterpiece, often warped but always perfect. Watching it shrink behind the oven door was part of the thrill. You would kneel on the floor, peering through the glass, and gasp as your drawing curled, twisted, and finally flattened. Kids made keychains, jewelry, ornaments. Whatever their imagination allowed, it felt like crafting with sorcery. One minute you were tracing cartoons or making friendship tags. The next you held a miniaturized relic in your palm. The smell of melting plastic filled the kitchen. Parents worried, but no one stopped us. Shrinky dinks were affordable, creative, and wildly popular at every sleepover and birthday party. You could even buy branded kits, superheroes, cartoon characters, holiday themes. But the best ones were always your originals. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing your art transformed like that. Tiny, tough, and totally unique. We never questioned the process. We just knew it felt like creating something real, something small that still felt huge. TV dinners turned the living room into a dining room, one foil tray at a time. They were not new in the 1960s, but this was the decade they really took off, just as television became the centerpiece of American family life. You got a little compartment for meatloaf, one for mashed potatoes, another for corn, maybe a brownie tucked into the corner. All you had to do was pop it in the oven, wait, and serve. No planning, no cleanup, no arguing over what to cook. The tray itself felt futuristic. Everything had its place. The food was not gourmet, but it was warm, salty, and comforting in its predictability. Families could eat while watching their favorite shows. Kids could feel like grown-ups with their own personal meal. The appeal was clear, fast, easy, and made to match the rhythm of modern life. TV dinners were more than just food. They were a new way to eat, one that said it was okay to sit on the couch and focus on The Ed Sullivan Show or Bonanza. The clang of a fork against aluminum still echoes in memory. For many, it was the sound of dinner and television becoming one. Mood rings promised to reveal your soul with nothing but heat-sensitive liquid and a silver band. They hit stores in the 1970s and immediately became a cultural phenomenon. Kids were obsessed. What color was yours? Blue meant calm. Green meant normal. Black meant, well, probably nothing good. But did the colors really reflect your emotions? Of course not. Still, that did not matter. It felt like magic, like your feelings were finally visible, like someone could see how you felt without you having to explain it. And in a decade where kids were just starting to explore self-expression, that meant something. Mood rings were not flashy. They were not expensive, but they made you feel seen. Like a tiny piece of jewelry could make sense of the chaos in your chest. You wore it to school. You compared with friends. You checked it constantly, not because it worked, but because you wanted it to. It became part of your identity. And even though you knew deep down it was just science reacting to body temperature, you believed the story. That was the power of being a kid in the 1970s. You let the world be strange and beautiful and just a little bit magical. Some nights, it was the backyard. Other times, it was the town planetarium where the air smelled like metal seats and carpet glue. But either way, Dad made sure you always looked up. He would point at a blinking light in the sky and say something like, "That one's Venus," even if it was just an airplane. You believed him, because he said it with the same certainty he used when fixing the lawnmower. Sometimes he would bring out a telescope that never quite focused right, but it did not matter. You could see the moon, or at least a very bright blur that had to be the moon, and that was enough. He told you about constellations, meteor showers, and a comet he swore he saw when he was 12. The planetarium nights were just as magical. You would lean back in those creaky seats while the ceiling lit up with galaxies and a deep voice narrated the birth of stars. Dad would whisper facts like he had a PhD in astronomy, even if he probably read them from the brochure 5 minutes before. You did not go to learn. You went to dream. And the only thing better than dreaming about space? Digging through the universe of stuff at the local flea market the very next weekend. Trapper Keepers were not just school supplies, they were status symbols. With their Velcro flaps and glossy over-the-top covers, they turned every classroom into a silent competition of who had the coolest binder. Some featured racing cars. Others showed rainbows, unicorns, or abstract laser patterns straight out of a sci-fi fever dream. Inside, everything was neatly organized. Folders, dividers, loose leaf paper, and secret notes passed during math class. The Velcro made a loud rip every time you opened it, an announcement that learning was about to begin, or at least be attempted. Trapper Keepers made you feel like you had your life together, even if your grades said otherwise. Teachers had a love-hate relationship with them. They were bulky, distracting, but undeniably effective at keeping your stuff in one place. And if you had one with a matching pencil case, you were royalty. Years later, people still remember the smell of the plastic, the feel of flipping through those laminated folders, and the thrill of sliding in a new pack of notebook paper. Trapper Keepers were not just for school, they were for showing off, staying organized, and feeling like you had a little piece of the future in your backpack. Before microwaves took over the world, there was Jiffy Pop. That iconic silver foil pan with the wire handle looked more like a science experiment than a snack. You placed it over the burner, turned the heat to medium, and waited. First, nothing. Then a rustle. Then a pop. Then a full-on explosion of sound as the silver dome started to rise. It puffed up like magic, growing rounder and louder until it looked like a shiny balloon about to burst. You shook the handle gently, trying not to burn the bottom. The anticipation was everything. Kids gathered around the stove like it was a campfire. Parents pretended not to worry it might go up in flames. And then it was done. You tore open the top and reached inside, burning your fingers on the edge, of course, for a handful of hot, buttery popcorn. It did not matter if half of it was burnt and the other half still kernels. It was the experience, the ritual. The popcorn was secondary. The fun was in the show. Jiffy Pop was not just a snack. It was a performance. And if you ever had a movie night that started with that sizzling silver pan, you remember the thrill of the balloon. Ice cubes were once a challenge, not a luxury. If you grew up with metal ice cube trays, Lightbrite turned a dark room into a glowing gallery. Introduced by Hasbro in 1967, this toy was unlike anything else at the time. It featured a black screen lit from behind and a box of tiny colored pegs, red, green, blue, orange, that you pushed through holes to create luminous designs. You could trace pre-printed templates or freestyle your own masterpiece. A clown's grin, a sailboat at sunset, your own name glowing like a neon sign. The warmth from the light bulb behind the screen gave it a cozy feeling, and the soft glow made your room feel like magic. It was quiet play, patient play, the kind where your tongue stuck out in concentration and the world around you disappeared. Parents loved that it was mess-free. Kids loved that they were in control. Once finished, you sat back in the dark and admired your work, a tiny artist with your own spotlight. Over time, more templates arrived, cartoon characters, animals, seasonal themes. But even with no pattern at all, the effect was the same. A toy that made you feel like a creator. In a world before screens lit up everything, Lightbrite lets you light up something of your own, one peg at a time. If Sesame Street was your preschool best friend, the Electric Company was your cool older sibling. Airing in the 1970s, it was wild, fast-paced, and just a little bit chaotic in the best way. It taught reading through sketches, songs, animations, and goofy superheroes who shouted phonics like they were battle cries. It was loud, it was weird, and it was impossible to forget. With a cast that included Morgan Freeman and Rita Moreno, the Electric Company did not talk down to kids, it pulled them up. It made reading feel like something urgent, something fun, something that could change the world. You did not just sit back and watch, you joined in. You sounded out words with them. You felt like part of the team. It blurred the line between learning and entertainment. It showed that intelligence and humor were not opposites. They were partners. And for kids who felt bored or left behind in school, the Electric Company gave them a way in, a way to laugh and learn at the same time. It was messy and magical, full of wordplay and wonder, and it proved that even the alphabet could be electric. The oddball roadside museum was where logic went to take a nap. You saw the hand-painted sign from the highway, "Come see the world's largest pencil," or "America's first toaster still works." Dad would swerve into the gravel lot like it was destiny. Admission was cheap, $3 cash only, and worth every penny. The inside was a fever dream. Display cases filled with bottle caps from all 50 states. A whole wall dedicated to vintage shampoo bottles. A two-headed taxidermy calf that haunted your dreams for a week. "You brought the kid today, huh?" he would say, as if Dad came here weekly. You followed them through rooms of strange collections while Dad laughed and read every single placard out loud. It was like watching a kid in a candy store, only the candy was lawn darts, Pez dispensers, and World War II ration kits. "Now this," Dad would say, holding up a glass jar with something floating in it. "This is history." And even though you rolled your eyes, part of you agreed. But if you really want to feel history in motion, just wait until you join him by the old train tracks, watching boxcars roll by, counting like your life depended on it. Mixtapes were handwritten love letters wrapped in cassette cases. You waited by the radio for hours just to hit record at the perfect moment, trying to catch the start of your favorite song without the DJ talking over it. You rewound, replayed, and carefully curated the perfect order so each track melted into the next. Some were made for crushes, others for best friends. Some were sorry tapes, and some were just because. Each one had a theme, a purpose, and a heart behind it. You picked songs that said what you could not. Then you labeled the tape in your best handwriting, maybe decorated the case, and handed it over like it was treasure. Because it was. A great mixtape took hours, sometimes days, to get just right. And when someone gave you one, you listened to it until the tape wore thin and the sound warped. Mixtapes were not just music, they were memories, feelings, time capsules wrapped in magnetic ribbon. And long after the songs faded, you remembered the person who made it, their handwriting, their choices, their message. Even now, in a world of playlists, nothing hits quite like the soft click of a tape deck and a song you once recorded just for someone else. Pop beads were not just a craft, they were a lifestyle. These chunky, colorful plastic beads snapped together with a satisfying click, turning into necklaces, bracelets, tiaras, or anything else your imagination dreamed up. Every little girl had a box of them. Every slumber party included at least one fashion show. But pop beads were more than accessories. They were building blocks. They were puzzles. They were surprisingly strong and endlessly versatile. You could pull them apart to start over or wear your creation all day like it was made of gold. They came in every color of the rainbow. Some were clear, some were glittery, some looked like tiny candies. And yes, sometimes you chewed on them even though you were not supposed to. Sometimes they turned into weapons, flicked across the room or used to bind your younger sibling. That was half the fun. Pop beads were part toy, part rebellion, They made you feel creative, independent, grown up even, until one popped off and vanished under the couch, never to be seen again. You always lost one, but the set never felt incomplete. You just made a shorter necklace. Pop beads were a rite of passage in childhood, bright, noisy, and totally unforgettable. Rotary phones were more than a way to talk. They were a ritual. Heavy, anchored to a table or wall and connected by a coiled cord, these phones had a satisfying weight and a rhythm all their own. Each number you dialed had to be carefully selected with a finger, spun around the circular dial, and released with a soft whir. If you dialed the wrong digit near the end, start over. It took patience, and that was part of the charm. You memorized numbers, you waited your turn. And when the phone rang, it was a real ring, loud, metallic, and impossible to ignore. Talking on the rotary phone meant stretching the cord down the hallway for privacy, wrapping it around your fingers during a long conversation, and sometimes having to politely ask someone to hang up because it was your turn to use it. There were no voicemails, no caller ID, just trust, timing, and the occasional busy signal. Today, a rotary phone feels like a relic, but for many growing up in the 1960s, it was a constant companion. From late-night talks to awkward first calls, its clicks and clatters are etched in memory like the voices it once carried. There was something sacred about turning off the lights and flipping on a Lightbrite. Suddenly, your bedroom transformed into a tiny, glowing studio. With each colored peg you pressed into the black screen, magic happened. Reds, blues, greens, and yellows lit up like little fireworks trapped in plastic. Introduced in the late 1960s but beloved through the 1970s, Lightbrite was not loud. It did not move or speak, but it taught kids something powerful: how to make beauty, one dot at a time. You started with a blank template or maybe a paper guide with letters, but over time, you stopped using instructions. You made your own stars, your own hearts, your own masterpieces. It was slow, patient, personal. The warmth of the bulb inside hummed beneath your fingers. You could feel the light, not just see it. Sometimes you messed up, pulled out the wrong peg. It did not matter. You just kept building, fixing, creating, and when you finally stepped back and saw your little glowing creation, it felt like pride. Not toy pride, real pride, because you did that. Lightbrite made every child an artist. And in a world of noise and chaos, it offered a quiet glow of control, creativity, and calm. The dented can discount grocery store was the kind of place you never admitted shopping at, unless you were dad. Then it was a badge of honor. You did not bring a list here. You brought instincts. Aisles of unlabeled tins, faded labels, and cardboard signs scribbled in permanent marker, 10 cans for $1. What cans? Who knew? Dad would hold one up and say, "Beef chunks and gravy." Sounds promising, like he was about to enter it in a cooking competition. Most of the time it was mystery meat roulette, but we were not there for the menu. We were there for the thrill. He treated the whole store like an auction. "Name brand beans. Get them while they last," he would whisper, like a man uncovering buried treasure. At checkout, he would proudly announce how much he saved. Never mind the fact that dinner might be spaghetti and something we would call tomato adjacent. You learned to laugh, to try everything once, and to realize a meal made on the cheap still meant you had one. But for a different kind of treasure, tucked away in someone's garage, let me tell you about the model train shop that made time stand still. Mall food court hangouts were not about the food, they were about freedom. Teenagers in the 1980s treated the mall like their second home, wandering its air-conditioned halls with nothing but pocket change and big plans to do absolutely nothing. The food court was the epicenter. Tables filled with cliques, couples, and groups of giggling friends stretched out time between slices of greasy pizza and soft pretzels. One soda could last hours, especially when refills were free. You scoped out crushes, eavesdropped on drama, and occasionally made eye contact with someone cool enough to nod back. Parents dropped you off and picked you up hours later, trusting the mall to act like a babysitter with bright lights and security guards. Whether you sat near the arcade or tucked into the corner by Orange Julius, The food court was a social stage. It was loud, it was messy, and it felt like your world. Every weekend brought the same faces, the same greasy trays, and the same comforting rhythm of adolescent independence. No one talked about it like it was special, but for those who grew up there, it was the perfect mix of noise, neon, and growing up in public. Long before music was digital, it spun on plastic. Record players with built-in speakers were the backbone of every teenager's room and every family living room. They were bulky, boxy, and usually brown or beige. But when you placed that needle on the groove, the room changed. You might remember hearing the Jackson 5, the Carpenters, or Fleetwood Mac for the very first time through one of these machines. The sound was warm, slightly fuzzy, and crackled at the edges, but it was alive. Kids would stack their 45s, adjust the tone arm, and lower the needle with care. These were not sleek devices. They were furniture. Some had lids that closed like a suitcase. Others had knobs you had to gently coax into the right spot. Volume? Not much. But intimacy? All the way. You sat close to it. You knew every skip and scratch on your favorite record. You could play the same song 10 times in a row and it felt new every time. It was not about convenience, it was about connection. The record player was not background noise, it was the centerpiece of your downtime. Hearing one today might just make you stop, listen, and remember who you were when that song first played. Etch A Sketch was a toy box essential for many kids growing up in the 1960s, a red-frame tablet that made art out of turning two little white knobs. Created in France and introduced to the American market in 1960, it was as magical as it was mechanical. There were no batteries, no screens, no noise, just pure possibility inside that gray powder-filled screen. The left knob controlled horizontal lines, the right knob handled vertical ones, and with patience and lots of do-overs, you could draw a house, a name, even a passable Mickey Mouse. But here's the kicker. If you messed up, you just shook the thing. That satisfying rattle erased the entire image in an instant, giving you a clean slate. It was frustrating. It was addictive. It was mesmerizing. You might remember twisting the knob so hard your fingers hurt, trying to make curves when all it wanted to give you was straight lines. Yet when you finally got something to look just right, the pride was real. Etch A Sketch was art, logic, and trial and error rolled into one simple frame. In a world of ever-evolving toys, this one stayed still, and that was its power. Micronauts were not household names like G.I. Joe or Star Wars toys, but for the kids who loved them, they were everything. Small, strange, and endlessly customizable, Micronauts were the science fiction building blocks of your imagination. Released in the late 1970s, they came with magnetic limbs, clear plastic torsos, interchangeable armor, and ships you could take apart and reconfigure 100 different ways. There was no show at first, no comic book, just you and your mind filling in the gaps. What planet did they come from? What powers did they have? It did not matter. You decided. The Micronauts were yours. One day they were heroes. The next, they were villains. Their limbs could pop off. Their vehicles turned into bases, walkers, or weapons. They were not just action figures. They were tools for storytelling. And every kid who had a handful knew the thrill of inventing whole galaxies on the living room floor. While other toys had scripts, Micronauts had potential. They invited you to build the adventure, not just follow it. They were futuristic, weird, and wild, and that made them unforgettable. In a time before everything came with instructions, Micronauts handed you the pieces and whispered, "Go create." The camera and film shop was a cathedral of forgotten technology. You walked in, and the air smelled like chemicals and time. Behind the counter, rows of yellow Kodak envelopes waited like tiny mysteries. Dad would head straight for the slide carousel projectors, lifting one like it was a sacred artifact. "Kodachrome," he would whisper. "They just don't make colors like that anymore." You did not know what he meant, but you believed it. You spun the projector just to hear the satisfying click, click, click of slides falling into place. There were shelves of lenses, tripods, flashbulbs in boxes older than you, and glass cases of secondhand cameras that looked more like museum pieces. Dad talked shop with the clerk, dropping words like aperture and ISO like he was reading from scripture. You picked up a Polaroid and tried to figure out how it worked. The clerk let you snap one. The photo came out blurry, overexposed, but it still felt like magic. Dad bought a roll of film, maybe 2, even though he already had 6 at home. Just in case, he would say, just in case the light hit right. And on the drive home, with the bag of film in his lap, he would say, "One quick stop." That stop? A smoky little pool hall where you got a taste of grown-up cool, even if just for one night. If one of these toys brought back a smile, or reminded you what fun looked like when you had to make it yourself, drop your favorite in the comments. Give this video a like to keep the memories spinning, and subscribe so you never miss the good stuff we grew up with.